everyone, and thanks for listening to another episode of the Future of Data Security. Today, I'm speaking with Carl Stern, Vice President of Information Security at Age of Learning. Carl, thank you so much for joining us.
I'm very excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm curious, maybe let's go right into it. What keeps you up at night as a security leader when you're protecting 50, 60 million children's data?
I think what keeps me up at night is knowing that, the decisions we make in security are directly affecting students and families who are trusting us with their children's data. It's not an abstract responsibility. It's real people depending on us to get this right. I think, when we're talking at that scale, tens of millions of children's data, the margin for error is pretty small, right? One misconfiguration, an overly permissive role, at that scale, small issues can have a big impact. So as a leader, I really think less about individual threats and more about whether the system is resilient, right? Are our controls layered? Do we have visibility across identity, application, infrastructure, third parties? Can we detect and contain something quickly? Are we reducing complexity instead of adding to it? So, at the end of the day, the threat landscape is changing weekly, right? But that doesn't change the responsibility. These students, these families, they don't get a say in how we secure their data. They're counting on us and assuming that we are building a program where security isn't bolted on. It's just part of how the organization operates.
We have multiple clients at Coash in that space, whether it's investment vehicle for kids, or young students and other types of value chain involving minors. And I often hear that it's quite horrific when a kid gets their identity stolen. People open up a credit bureau on them. They start doing things that could ruin that kid's life forever. Can you share some, what are the worst risks, especially when dealing with children, with kids? What are the worst case scenarios just for the audience to understand what we're dealing with here?
Yeah, I mean, I think you really hit the nail on the head there, right? I mean, these bad actors are after, a couple pretty basic things, right? They want to steal things that are lucrative, right? So if I'm protecting kids' data, I know that the adversaries want that data to do one of probably very few things with. And one of those things is, like you mentioned, I could open lines of credit. I could sell that information, which is also lucrative. And then whoever buys that information is collecting it and doing things that have real world repercussions for these kids and their families. And, these are the kind of things that we take very seriously. In fact, we're very cognizant of not collecting data that's not necessary, right? So obviously there's some data that's necessary and there's some that's not. And it would be pretty easy just to take it all and use what you need. But we're very prescriptive about what we collect and what we don't.
That's good to hear. I'm sure your customers will be happy to hear you have the narrowest of data that's required. Was looking at your background, you seem like a very technical guy, lots of great companies, Xperity, Kaplan. How did you go from the trenches of IT, being a practitioner, to now leading enterprise security programs for one of the foremost educational companies?
Yeah, it's been a journey. Where I am today wasn't always the goal, right? So I came up what I like to refer to as, the classic trenches route, right? So tech support, home and small business support, help desk, sysadmin, network admin, basically just fixing whatever's on fire that day, right? So, I mean, nothing about my career was glamorous. In fact, my first experience in the corporate IT world wasn't until quite a few years into my career. It was very blue collar IT work. And I honestly love that part of it. I think those experiences were critical to getting where I am today. So I certainly wouldn't take it back. I'm not sure I could do it again at this point, but it's part of who I am and how I got here. So I mean, we talk about security specifically and my journey. I think there was a specific moment when security really clicked for me. I was working as a systems and a network admin at Road Ranger, which is a gas station and truck stop chain. And our IT team was tiny. IT and software development were in the same org. Everyone wore lots of hats. And when it came time to get PCI compliant, my boss kicked off what felt like a really grassroots security overhaul. Incredibly hands-on. We're mapping networks, segmenting systems, hardening servers, just digging through every detail. And two skills among several that I learned from that boss at the time and still apply them to this day are: one, don't overlook anything, and two, keep digging until you understand the root cause. And you know, he pushed me harder than anyone had up to that point. This was around the time, if you remember, the big Target breach was in the news. So 2013, 2014 timeframe. And I think that was the moment where I connected the dots between the technical work I was doing and the real world consequences of getting it wrong. Right. And that was exciting to me. The PCI project is when I realized I was interested in security. I like thinking about, you know, how systems could break and how attackers might approach a problem. So, after that project, I didn't like become a security leader overnight, but I kept on taking on more security work. A few years later, I left and joined Practice Velocity as a senior sysadmin, which eventually became Xperity. It was a health tech company filled with incredibly smart people who were all doing what they thought was right. But it was clear on day one that, look, there's no formal or centralized security program. So, I went to my boss at the time and I said, I think you should make me a security admin. It wasn't a formal role at that time. And in fact, I think I made up the title. But, it was more like, let me take ownership of this and let me build something. And so, not long after that, I was promoted to manager. And then we merged with another company to form Xperity. And I moved into a director role. And that's really where the trajectory locked in. I had the chance to build an enterprise security program for a fast growing healthcare platform. And, everything I'd learned in those early trenches became the foundation of how I did that.
Can you tell us more about building programs? We were talking before the interview about HITRUST certification. I'd love to hear your thoughts on your experience there and how to build these programs.
Yeah. So at Xperity, I had the chance to build a security program from the ground up. At Age of Learning, I inherited an existing program and strengthened it. And I think both scenarios teach you different lessons. And honestly, starting from scratch can sometimes be easier, right? Because you get to pick the tools you trust, you get to hire the right people, you get to design a program with security in mind from day one. But, and I know this from personal experience, it's also where people can make the biggest mistake, which is trying to force controls in quickly without executive buy-in and without business alignment. And, you can move fast and shove things in, but if the business isn't aligned, you're going to find yourself fighting uphill every single day. People will see security as slowing them down rather than protecting the company. So I think the real playbook starts with understanding the goals of the business. So before you talk about frameworks or tools, you need to know what matters to the company, what level of risk they're willing to accept. What are the crown jewels, right? Is it PHI? Is it PII? Is it student data? Once you know that, then you can start the work to design a security program that protects the right things. And this is important, in a way that fits the company culture. And so, You mentioned high trust, and I just want to be clear about the certification part. So if we're talking about high trust, ISO, SOC 2, the certification itself isn't the goal, right? It's just a baseline. It means an external auditor looked at what you're doing and said, yes, this meets a minimum standard. Useful for sure, but it's not the win, right? The real win is everything underneath that certificate. So it's building processes that actually run every day. It's getting people to follow those processes because they understand the why. It's meeting the intent of the controls and building upwards from there. So it's creating a program that adapts, right? You're monitoring, you're improving in real time, not a program that comes alive once a year during audit season. So I think, when you do all of that right, the certification, high trust or whatever else it is, that almost becomes a side effect, right? It's just someone validating that you're already operating in a, very intentional, secure way.
I'm curious if you can elaborate on the difference in terms of securing unstructured data and structured data. Let's make a simple example. It's relatively easy to secure data in databases, but what about files? What about other systems? Can you share your perspective and how you approach securing both types of data?
Yeah, I mean, that's the challenge, right? I mean, I think to a certain extent, securing structured data is the easy part. So yeah, when we're talking about unstructured data, I think, from a very high level perspective, it's just like any other control, right? You need, from an organizational perspective, you need an administrative control, right? And that's usually in the form of some policy that says, here's what you can do and here's what you can't do. And it's usually paired with some sort of process or maybe many processes, right? And making sure that your folks know that that policy exists, they understand it, and they understand the processes. But that's all just administrative, right? There's nothing preventing them from not following those processes. So you also need to pair that with technical controls. So that comes in the form of data loss protection tools or prevention tools, endpoint detection tools. So, and maybe you're not preventing these things. Maybe you're just monitoring and you're alerting on it. And maybe you're only alerting on it because you want to form a baseline and you want to know when things fall out of those baselines. But I think at the end of the day, no matter how you do it, you need to pair technical controls with those administrative controls. And I think that's where a lot of organizations fall down, especially newer startups, right? They're like, well, we have the policy. Why are people not following it? Well, first of all, do people even know that policy exists? But secondly, you need to have a technical control in place so you can at least monitor what's happening.
I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about AI because everybody's talking about it. It certainly has a global effect on cybersecurity. Can you tell me about some use cases you've seen where, wow, AI has a huge impact, this really works, and perhaps share some examples where what was promised is really not happening, perhaps for a future time?
Yeah, I think, I think when we're talking about AI, at the end of the day, I think from a business perspective, what leadership wants to do is they want to enable better business outcomes and enable the workforce to be more efficient. So, I think it's really important, and I've seen this firsthand, that people understand what AI is, what it can and can't do, right? It's not magic and it's not truly intelligent either. And so I think when you frame it that way and we can look at it as a tool that can enable us to maybe move a little bit quicker, but is not going to solve problems for us, I think that's where we start to see some actual improved business outcomes and some traction. So, you know, the mundane stuff, right? I can say, like, from a security operations perspective, when we're writing incident reports, right? AI is super helpful there because we can train an AI agent on what our report, format needs to be. And we can feed it some details from an investigation. and it can output a report for us in a matter of seconds versus, maybe a day that it would take a human being to do that. And so I think those are some big efficiencies. Another specifically in the security space is really automating the fire hose volume of alerts that come in to, come across an analyst's desk, right? So they're not dealing with so much noise anymore, and the humans can really focus on the signal from all that noise, right? So AI can filter out and bubble up the items that actually need a human's attention versus wasting all that time vetting false positives.
Okay, I wanted to ask about your decision-making process and when you're leading security at a small company, mid-sized company with a lean team, how do you decide where to spend so you can sleep well at night, keep the security at the right level?
Yeah, it's a good one. When you're working with a lean team, I think every dollar has to have a purpose, right? You can't possibly cover everything. So you focus on the investments that measurably reduce risk. And I think with limited resources, the smartest thing you can do is the math. So, let's take something like a 24/7 SOC, right? Most companies, I think, despite what maybe you might hear, most companies can't staff that internally. So you do the math, right? Like, what would it cost to hire enough analysts to cover every shift, handle turnover, provide ongoing training, and support them with the right tooling? And you compare that against the cost of, let's say, a top tier managed SOC. And on paper, that managed SOC is going to look expensive. But once you compare that to the true cost of staffing internally and to the potential cost of the risk of not having that capability at all, I think the decision becomes pretty clear. So I apply the same calculus to every investment, right? Does the control reduce our actual risk in a measurable way? Does it automate the work my team currently does manually? And does it protect our crown jewels? And if the answer is no to all three of those, then it probably doesn't belong in a small team's budget. I mean, look, the goal is to spend in a way that reduces the most risk for the business with the resources that you actually have.
One of the things I wanted to ask about, since you were involved across different sectors, healthcare, education, gaming, retail, is if you've seen patterns in terms of threats and attack across these industries, or are there major differences that you've observed?
Yeah, there's really not. It's funny because I've been asked this question before, and I think, it may be surprising to some, but even though these industries look different on the surface, I think the attacker's goals are almost always the same, which is why the attack patterns barely change. The attackers, again, they follow value. They don't care what industry you're in. They care about what is worth the most and what's the easiest path to get it, right? So they're always after the same things, generally speaking, right? Like credentials they can reuse or sell, financial or personal data they can monetize, and access they can pivot from, right? Like VPN or cloud console. And because these are the same, so are the attack patterns, right? We're looking at, phishing attacks for credentials, exploiting misconfigurations, cloud or probably identity, taking advantage of vulnerable or poorly written code, and using third parties as a weak link. This stuff hasn't changed. And, a big reason is the industry still doesn't prioritize secure by design engineering, right? Most companies ship fast and secure later, and there's no real incentive to rewrite insecure code or rethink architecture until something goes wrong. And attackers know this, right? They rely on companies leaving the same doors open year after year. And, speaking of AI, modern tools like AI they're not changing the goals. They're just making these same attacks faster and more scalable.
When I heard you say, "Ship fast and secure later," I was like, "No," thinking about our own team, that's something I'd never wanna hear.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
You mentioned AI. Do you think bad actors are weaponizing AI differently than traditional threats? What are you seeing there with new attacks, different threats?
Not necessarily. I don't think AI changed any of that stuff, right? So I don't think AI changes what attackers want. AI just makes them better, faster, stronger, right? So I think attackers are like, here's the fundamental problem. Attackers are adopting AI a lot faster than defenders are because they don't have any constraints. They can use any model, push it in any direction, and automate the parts of an attack that used to take time and real skill. And meanwhile, defenders are over here asking, do we have a policy for this? Did legal approve it? Is this SOC 2 compliant? So we're trying to use AI responsibly, which means we move slower by design. So, I think AI supercharges the same attack patterns we've seen for years, right? It just makes it better. Phishing looks human and it's context aware. We've got reconnaissance now that runs nonstop and at scale. Exploit development and code modification used to require expertise, not so much with AI. It's really dramatically lowering the barrier to entry. Somebody who couldn't pull off a sophisticated attack before can now have AI do most of the heavy lifting. And I think there's another shift coming that people don't talk about enough. And that is, historically, unless you were one of the big companies, you were a Facebook or a Google or an Oracle or a government agency, the odds of somebody spending the time and money to burn a 0 day on your company were pretty low. And I think AI is changing that. It lowers the cost and effort required to discover and refine vulnerabilities. Attackers can use AI to automate exploit research in ways we've never seen before. And I think that's going to mean that 0 day risk really expands to everybody, beyond just, the big companies.
That's very interesting. I think we're gonna see more of these, as you said, existing risks just on a steroid, a hyper accelerated schedule. You said something really contentious earlier. You said, the cybersecurity industry shouldn't exist. And I wanted to give you a chance to explain that. Why are you saying that? What do you mean by it?
Yeah, so I think, Jen Easterly, if you know Jen Easterly, the former CISA director, she's actually got a really great piece that she wrote on this in Foreign Affairs that captures this really well. She talks about how the cybersecurity industry isn't really a cybersecurity problem; it's a software quality problem, and I agree with her. I think most of the time, attackers aren't using some magical 0 day or some exotic exploit. They're just taking advantage of defects that should never have made it into production. And again, companies are incentivized to ship fast, win customers, add new features, and not slow down engineering by, being secure from the beginning. And because there's almost no accountability or liability for insecure software, the cost of insecurity gets pushed downstream to customers, and to the cybersecurity teams trying to protect those customers. And that's really the point I'm getting at is I think because of all that, we've built this massive aftermarket industry, tools, services, platforms, consultants whose entire job is to bolt security onto systems after they've already been released. And from a business perspective, I guess that makes sense, but from a systemic standpoint, it's backwards. I think where Easterly really gets it right is that AI gives us a real chance to change this, right? AI can help us write safer code, find defects earlier, modernize legacy systems, right, which is the bane of a lot of companies, and maybe finally shift us from a reactive model to a preventative one. So, when I say cybersecurity industry shouldn't exist, what I really mean is like the tooling ecosystem shouldn't have to exist at the scale it does today. If software were built securely by default, most of what we're defending against would disappear. That's not to say, defenders are never going away, right? Like even in a secure by design world, we'll still have infrastructure weaknesses, misconfigurations, unpredictable failure models, but supply chain issues, but the biggest attack surface of all, I think, is still going to be people, right? Attackers will always find a new way to social engineer, impersonate, manipulate, right? And another area that's affected by AI, like AI is supercharging that, right? It's making these social engineering attacks so much more effective, so much more believable. But, at the end of the day, technology can eliminate a lot of these preventable flaws, but it's not going to eliminate human behavior. So I think we really need to shift our thinking about how AI can enable us to build, products that are secure by design, not only how can AI help us ship things faster.
Yeah, I think you have a good point there. It's really mind-boggling. Even if you look at the biggest companies ever, like Microsoft and Apple, that provide the operating system, the backbone, it's really crazy with the scope, the size, the investments that, they're locked in a continuing battle with zero-day exploits. And it's kind of crazy when you put it this way and you stop to think about it. Like, why is that happening? Why can't it be more locked in? I guess it's just the underlying nature of technology. It can be hacked. It's you would need to grow new fingers to plug all the holes. Like, kind of interesting to think about that, eh?
Yeah, and I think we've just built this whole ecosystem, and you know this is just how it is, right? And people just expect it to be this way.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. It almost sounds like a conspiracy, except it's not, right? It's one of those things. I'd be curious, given where you're at now, if you would have some key pieces of advice for someone that's new, starting in security, or the future CISOs out there listening.
As a CISO, your first job is not to fix security. Your first job is to understand the business. So, you really need to get executive alignment early. You need to learn what the business actually cares about, and you need to pick your battles. Build relationships with people throughout your organization, and do that before you're putting controls in. Don't force security in. Bring people along with you. I think we've all heard the old adage that hire slow, fire fast. That applies to tools and processes as well. So I think at the end of the day, you can't just show up with controls. You've got to get people on board first, or nothing you implement is going to last, and you're just going to be fighting every day uphill.
Yeah, I guess with everything, you should do proper planning. And if you find you made a mistake, quickly rectify it. Sounds so simple, right? But how many people get in trouble?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, it's about all the time we have for today. So thank you very much, Carl, for coming on. Before we finish, if people want to follow along with your work, where can they find you?
Probably the best place to connect with me is on LinkedIn.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Carl. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.